Could a buried, fetid pit of shark flesh once have been the difference between life and death for an entire island? How did people cross the North Atlantic in the 10th century with no refrigeration and almost no salt, yet return with enough food to settle new lands? And why, in a world that praises steel and sail, has so much of Viking ingenuity been written into barns, smokehouses, and the soil beneath their houses? A cold wind over the Lofoten Islands can tell the story better than any chronicle. Listen to it and you hear saltless preservation. Fish that becomes as hard as wood, meat soured until it will slice like butter, oil sealed into peat that will outlive the men who buried it. This is a story that moves from fjord to cellar, from the hands of coopers to the pits of Greenland, and from the practical journals of monasteries to the poetry of the sagas. It follows voyages from the first raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD to the settlement of Iceland Sea, 870 AD, and Eric the Red's Greenland in 985 AD. Not because all these events are about food, but because without reliable food systems, those voyages would never have been attempted. If this line of inquiry interests you, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Because the hours and places we live in shape what food we value and how we keep it. That simple fact was as true for a farmer on a Vestfold ridge in the 9th century as it is for you on your street today. The Viking Age, conventionally dated from 793 AD to 1066 AD, sits on a longer arc of northern innovation. People in Scandinavia had been drying, smoking, fermenting, and freezing food for centuries before a warship sailed for Lindisfarne. Archaeology shows that Iron Age and even Bronze Age communities in the north used elevated granaries and smoke-drying pits. The methods the Vikings perfected were evolutionary, not miraculous. Yet the scale and strategic use of those methods during the Viking Age was unprecedented. Two forces drove that scale: environment and necessity. The climate offered cold winds and long winters. The economy offered herds and seas full of fish. Salt, produced by evaporating seawater or mined inland, was expensive and patchily available. Where it existed, it was traded like precious metal. Where it didn't, people adapted by composing systems that used wind, acid, and smoke, each method playing its part in a seasonal cycle of harvest, preservation, and storage. Start at the shoreline. In the Lofoten archipelago and along rugged fjords from Hordaland to Troms, you can still see the skeletal frames known in Norwegian as gjell. These racks are not quaint stage props, they are the backbone of stockfish production. Cod, caught heavily during the winter months, was gutted, tied in pairs by their tails, and hung on these poles in open air. When the temperature hovered around freezing, with steady, dry winds, the fish froze and thawed by micro-fluctuations, while insects and most spoilage bacteria were absent or inactive. Over weeks and months the fish lost water, firmed, and transformed into stockfish, sometimes losing as much as 80% of its moisture, until it was bone-dry and almost petrified. Sailors could store such fish for years. When it was time to eat, sailors would rehydrate the strips before cooking. The preserved protein was light, compact, and dense with calories. The origins of this practice predate the Viking Age. There is evidence that communities in northern Norway were making dried fish long before 800 AD. Even so, the commercialization, turning drying into an industry that could feed fleets and fill trade ships, reached a new intensity in the 9th and 10th centuries. Medieval accounts, later trading records, and archaeological layers at docks and trading centres show the product's trajectory from fjord to European markets. Lofoten's stockfish became an export staple. It entered markets as far away as the Mediterranean. The dried cod that commercial ports in Bergen and elsewhere packed into small, dense bales became a commodity traded for grain, textiles, and metal. Economic historians point to this as one of the northern trades that helped link the Scandinavian periphery to continental Europe. Drying worked because of climate and technique. The users of the hyel knew how to choose the right exposure so that wind could do the gradual work. Too much sun, and the outer layers would cook and case harden, trapping moisture inside. Too much warmth and flies and bacteria would turn the fish into a disaster. The artisans of drying could read weather and wind as a smith read steel. They also understood timing. Winter-spawned catches hung through spring, when the low-angle sun and steady winds were perfect. The result was a product that became a kind of food architecture, stacks of wood racks on the coast like cathedrals of drying flesh. This industrial-scale practice stands in contrast to the romantic image of a Viking with a salted herring in his knapsack. Salt existed, but it was not the foundation. That salt myth is worth a pause because it's persistent. Many modern narratives imagine that everyone salted everything, imagining a medieval world where barrels of brine were as common as barrels of water. The truth is more complicated and, for our purposes, more revealing. Salt was labour-intensive to produce in the north. Along the Atlantic coast, salt making required evaporating seawater in large pans over heat, a process that demanded fuel and time. Inland, rock salt could be mined, but was geographically limited. Historical records, including charters and trade lists, show salt traded at significant cost. It functioned like a luxury good in many northern communities. That scarcity turned mind toward alternatives. The Vikings had to think in systems, not single fixes. They used what the land offered and made interconnected technologies, drying where wind and cold allowed, smoking where wood and controlled heat could be managed, fermentation where dairy was abundant, and the earth itself where bogs and permafrost could serve. The second major technique is fermentation in sour milk byproducts. Whey, skyer, and other acidic liquids. Scandinavia has long been a dairy culture. Cows, sheep, and goats were crucial to subsistence. Cheese-making was not just about producing a treat, it was a step in preservation. When curds were formed into cheese, or when skyer, a thick fermented milk product similar to strained yogurt, was produced, large quantities of whey remained. Whey is acidic because lactic acid bacteria have converted milk sugars into lactic acid during fermentation. That acidity inhibits many pathogenic bacteria. The Vikings learned to harness acidity as a preservative. Pieces of meat or fish were packed into barrels and submerged under whey, or soured milk, sealed and stored in cool cellars, or even buried in the ground where temperatures stayed low. The barrels created an anaerobic, acidic environment that could preserve protein for months. This practice appears in Icelandic and Norwegian sources in a fragmentary way, but law codes and sagas hint at its everyday usage. The method is described in later Icelandic accounts by authorities who drew on oral traditions. Caution is necessary when reading sagas as direct technical manuals, but they provide cultural testimony. Acidity was a known, domestic method of keeping meat through uncertain winters. Archaeological finds of sealed barrels in bogs and in ship context, sometimes with residues suggesting dairy acids, support the interpretation. Where salt was unavailable or unaffordable, acid was a practical substitute. Unlike salt curing, which requires large quantities of granular salt to extract moisture by osmosis, whey preservation accomplished several tasks. It created a hostile environment for decay organisms. It pre-digested tough fibres, making cheap cuts tender, and it used a byproduct the farm already produced. In functional terms, that is efficient resource management. A myth-busting moment falls here. Contemporary audiences often assume that fermented meat meant wild and rotten food. Historical practice was not carelessness, it was controlled microbiology. The Vikings did not randomly let meat rot, they engineered conditions. They sealed barrels, monitored acidity, and used cool storage. The process required knowledge and experience, and when done properly, it yielded safe, edible food. When done badly, as in any culture, it yielded spoilage and sickness. The difference between a practiced village and an unlucky household could be the difference between winter failure and survival. Smoke sits between these two worlds, not cold and dry, not sour and sealed, but warm, aromatic and chemical. Smoking's as much chemistry as craft. The Vikings used hot smoking when they needed to cook and preserve food for short-term use, but their true art was cold smoking. Cold smoking is slow. A smouldering fire produces cool smoke that circulates through a closed chamber. Over days or weeks, the smoke deposits phenolic compounds and aldehydes on the surface of meat or fish. These compounds are antimicrobial and antioxidant. They slow rancidity and discourage bacterial growth. The Vikings had smokehouses, sometimes simple sheds, sometimes subterranean pits, where blubber, fish and meat were hung above smoky pits. Different woods gave different flavours and different preservation properties. Alder and juniper are frequently mentioned in accounts and local practices, and coastal households would have known which timbers imparted a subtle sweetness and which produced harsher phenols. Cold smoking required attention. If the fire flared, the product could be partially cooked or charred. If smoke circulation was poor, pockets would not be preserved evenly. The labour investment was high, but the return was a flavourful, fairly long-lasting product that could be eaten with less rehydration than stockfish. Smoked herring and salmon would have been luxuries compared to dried cod, but they were highly prized. Smokehouses were also social centres. Maintaining a cold smoke operation was not a solitary task. It bound households together in labour and knowledge exchange. Today, smoked salmon remains a Scandinavian delicacy, but it is also a living link to an old preservation logic. Where wind and smoke and acid each had limits, the earth itself became a vault. The stabber, the raised storehouse, is a visible form of storage innovation. Built on pillars to protect against rodents and damp, raised granaries kept grain, seeds, dried fish, and light goods safe and dry. Inside family houses, cellars, and underground pits provided steady cold. In colder latitudes, even simple pits could offer permafrost-like conditions. But the more curious and archaeologically revealing practice is the intentional use of peat bogs and anaerobic ground for preservation. Bog-buried barrels, sometimes sealed and weighted, yield remarkable finds to modern archaeologists. Bog butter, oil preserved for decades, and occasionally preserved meat. Peatlands are acidic, cold and oxygen poor. A combination enemies of decomposer bacteria. Seeds, leather and wooden artefacts are frequently preserved in peat bogs for millennia. For food, that meant the bog acted as a natural jar. People lowered barrels of butter or oil into peat and covered them. Centuries later, archaeologists have found these deposits with recognisable fats inside, sometimes even with the copperage intact. Bog butter, in particular, is a complex historical artefact. We find lumps of fat in bog contexts dated from prehistory to the medieval period. The interpretations are contested. Sometimes it appears to be votive offerings. Sometimes it is simply storage that escaped consumption. But in the Viking context, on farms where herds produced surpluses of cream, burying butter made sense for long-term reserves. The flavour would change, the texture waxen, but it stayed protected from rancidity by the anaerobic low-temperature conditions. The apparent strangeness to modern palates masks a rational adaptation. Fat is calorie-dense and historically expensive to produce. To secure it against lean years, you protect it. The peat served as inexpensive preservation infrastructure. The strangest, most theatrical method blends burial, fermentation, and the slow chemistry of microbial breakdown. The preparation of fermented shark, historically associated with Iceland. Greenland shark meat is highly toxic when fresh, owing to high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide that make it poisonous without processing. The Norse settlers in Iceland and later in Greenland could not waste a resource that swam in abundance near their coasts. Their answer was an extended detoxification and preservation sequence. The shark's interior flesh, once butchered, was placed in shallow pits in gravel or sand, sometimes with rocks as weights. Under pressure, and in an environment that encouraged fluids to be expelled, the tissue fermented. Over weeks to months, those fluids drained away, and bacterial action transformed compounds that were poisonous into others that were not. After the initial pit aging, the meat was air-dried on racks similar to the hjell. The finished product, hakal in modern Icelandic practice, has a strong ammonia odour and a taste that divides palates. For those who lived where the shark swam, it was food. The process required logistical space, pits near the shoreline, a disciplined schedule for turning and hanging, and the judgment to know when the meat had crossed from dangerous to edible. Archaeology and ethnography converge here. There are accounts from later centuries that describe the process in detail, and modern Icelandic practice preserves the tradition. The Viking-era use of fermentation to render inedible protein, edible demonstrates an adaptability that is both pragmatic and biochemical. It is not mysticism. It is the application of local microbiology and physical pressures in a controlled, repeatable fashion. It required both courage and careful empirical testing, generation after generation. That willingness to embrace slow, sloppy processes and render them into reliable systems is as technical as any foundry. Logistics connected all of this. It was one thing to dry cod and smoke meat in a single season. It was another to assemble a ship with enough compact, reliable calories to cross stormy seas. The Viking longships were not simply instruments of war, they were vessels of supply. Their holds were optimized for space and stability. Barrels of whey-cured meat, bales of stockfish, heads of hard cheese, sacks of flatbread and boxes of dried peas moved as organized cargo. The seafaring sagas and later legal texts imply that householders packed and parcelled supplies carefully for journeys. The person responsible for a ship's victuals, whether a shipowner, chieftain or merchant, needed to know which food could withstand the damp spray, which must be sealed in barrels, and which could not be taken at all. Coopers in the Viking world achieved a remarkable technical standard. Good copperage meant watertight barrels that could be hoisted, lashed and sealed with pitch. The cooper's skill made long voyages practical. Barrels of sour whey, if properly sealed, could survive months of rolling. Heads of cheese could be waxed and banded to resist mould. Dried fish could be tied in bundles that took almost no space. The cargo manifested an economic and logistical mind, maximise calories per volume, minimise spoilage risk, and plan for the contingency of storms and port calls where resupply might be uncertain. Onboard diets reflected these calculations. Stockfish supplied protein in a surprising compact form. Dried meat and smoked products gave variety and fat. Hard cheeses and crackers provided carbohydrates and continuity. Beer or weak ale was safer and more durable than open water, so it travelled in barrels and served both as sustenance and as a mild antiseptic beverage. The result was a functional diet that kept rowers and warriors moving across cold oceans for weeks. Chronology threads through these practices. The early raids of the late 8th century, beginning with Lindisfarne in 793 AD, were not the first time Norse people crossed the sea. They were the first time an economy of seaborne predators and traders gained such intensity that larger logistical demands emerged. Within 2 generations, settlement colonization shifted the focus from raiding to sustaining communities in remote islands. Iceland's settlement c. 870 AD required organised provisioning. Eric the Red's Greenland expedition in 985 AD demanded even more resilience. Those settlements were not self-sufficient in every season and relied on preserved supplies, trade, and adaptive agriculture that the medieval warm period, roughly c. 900 from 1250 AD, temporarily enabled. But the logistics of provisioning stayed foundational. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland Sea 1000 AD combined the need to carry surplus with the need to exploit new resources. Without the ability to stock ships with durable food that didn't rely on imported salt, those voyages would have been riskier. Written sources complement archaeological evidence. Adam of Bremen, writing c. 1070 AD, describes northern peoples and overseas trade with some specificity, though with a clerical distance. The Icelandic sagas and the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, combine oral memory with later codification. They are not neutral, but they carry practical details of food and wintering that reflect lived knowledge. Law codes and farm inventories scattered through Scandinavian medieval documents include lists of storehouses, measures of lard and grain, and even regulations on how to prevent rodent invasion. Taken together, these sources sketch an economy attentive to preservation. Practices varied by place and season. On the exposed coasts where wind was reliable, stockfish dominated. In inland valleys with abundant dairy, acidic preservation and cheese were central. Coastal and island communities, with access to ample driftwood, favoured smokehouses and cold smoking. Where peatlands were extensive, bogs burial of butter and oil served as stockpiles. The technologies were complementary. A single farm might produce skyer as a daily food, use whey to preserve meat for winter, cold smoke herring for the household, and bury surplus butter in a peat bog for a desperate season. It was a multi-layered system. That redundancy made the whole more resilient to failed harvests, bad weather, or the demands of war. Human agency appears in the small choices: what wood to use, when to seal a barrel, which slope to choose for a storage pit. We can imagine a farmer in Vestfold in the 9th century selecting alder for herring smoke, reading wind to place a hjell on an exposed outcrop, watching a barrel seal, and retarring it as winter came. We can imagine a ship owner loading a ship in 1002 AD, bargaining for a bale of stockfish in exchange for grain from the Baltic. We can imagine the skill of standing watch in a smokehouse, tending the smoulder while night fell, and the meat drew the aromatic film that would keep it for months. These small quotidian acts are where systems become real. Against this practical picture are lingering biases. Popular culture often reduces Vikings to pillagers who fed themselves by blitzkrieg and took sustenance wherever they went. That image has a kernel of truth. Coastal raids were spectacular, but it misrepresents a society that put enormous intellectual capital into long-term provisioning. The staples of a Viking voyage: stockfish, smoked meat, fermented and whey-cured protein, bog butter reserves, are evidence that these were not improvised attacks, but operations with long chains of supply, social organisation, and craft. The sagas, when they describe stockades of preserved food, are not embellishing. They are describing what a maritime society needed. Material evidence supports that organisation. Archaeologists excavating Viking-age settlements like Oseberg and Gokstad, ship burials dated c. 834 AD and c. 900 AD respectively, have found organic residues, traces of preserved food and household equipment, implying sophisticated food practices. Oseberg's burial goods include wooden containers and traces of foodstuffs among textile and household deposits. Similarly, coastal migration zones show patterns of drying racks, smokehouses and pottery, suited to storage. Excavations in Iceland reveal fermentation pits and evidence of skyer production, while Greenland's Norse farms show cellars and graves with diet-related isotopes, suggesting dependency on preserved marine protein. Trade networks intensified these methods. Stockfish entered markets and returned as grain, cloth, and metal. That interdependency means that the ability to preserve and create excess mattered economically. The Lofoten archipelago's modern stockfish industry is a living echo of that trade chain. The same racks and wind that once filled a Viking longship now produce a product exported to southern Europe. This continuity demonstrates that methods perfected in the Viking Age had staying power. They were not desperate makeshift tactics, but efficient technologies fit to the environment. What about taste? Our modern noses often recoil from the ammonia of Harkal or the pungent tang of fermented herring. Yet these were not mere survival foods. They were integrated into diets rich in dairy, grains where available, and fresh produce when seasons allowed. Cheese matured into intensely savoury hard cheeses. Smoked and dried products carried flavour as well as calories. Food preserved for ships did more than prevent death by starvation. It supported morale, cultural continuity, and even diplomacy. Gifting preserved stockfish or smoked boar could be a political act. The forensic study of residues in cooking vessels and isotope analysis of bones shows varied diets. Preserved fish and meat are visible components, but not the entire story. There are failures and limits to the system. Fermentation can go wrong. Barrels can leak. Storms can spoil exposed racks. Rodents can gnaw through posts. Legal codes contain regulations aimed at preventing spoilage and theft. But the advantage of a multi-pronged preservation strategy is resilience. Where one method failed, another could fill the gap. In years of poor wind, smoke and brine played larger roles. In years where dairy fat was abundant, whey or peat-based storage increased. That flexibility was a strategic asset. Now consider the cultural dimensions. Food is identity. Over centuries, the practices of preservation shaped social rituals. Festivals where stockfish was rehydrated and served, rites involving shared consumption of fermented foods, and communal labour around smokehouses and yells. The practices of production and preservation were gendered and generational. Certain tasks were transmitted within households and shaped craft communities. The cooper's trade, the smokehouse's watch, the selection of wood. These were learned skills carried forward. Language carries traces. Words for preserved foods enter legal lists and poetry. When a skald praised a feast, the taste of preserved fish or smoked boar would be part of the sensory field. Preservation was not merely technical, it was woven into the social fabric. We can also see the long-term geopolitical consequences. The ability to project force across water correlates with supply chains. The Norse expansions into Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, Iceland, Greenland, and brief forays into North America depended on a sustained maritime logistics capability. The same preservation technologies that fed a family in Vestfold sustained the fleets that crossed to Britain and Ireland, allowing settlement and the establishment of trading networks. In that sense, food preservation participated in history at scale. It is part of the reason why Norse culture could leave such a broad footprint across the North Atlantic. Modern practices preserve echoes. Stockfish from Norway still follows the same basic process. Caught in winter, hung to dry on racks, exported to Italy and Portugal where it is a culinary tradition. Iceland continues to make harkal for local consumption and tourist curiosity. Its preparation connects a living culture to a survival technique stretched into taste. Smoked fish and cheeses remain staples. Even peat-buried fats occasionally turn up to remind us that ancient methods leave material traces. The continuity says as much about cultural pride as about technique. Practices that kept people alive became identity markers, then delicacies. There is a deeper lesson about ingenuity. Technologies don't have to be novel to be revolutionary. To turn wind, smoke, and sour milk into reliable storages of protein is to practice an ecological intelligence that is tuned to local resources. The Vikings rarely invented new chemistry. They turned place into supply. They learned the right microclimate for a shell, the right wood for a smoke, the right acidity to inhibit rot. In a comparative sense, their system sits alongside other historical storage technologies, salting in Mediterranean systems, sun-drying in temperate latitudes, or smoke curing in forested regions, as a region-specific solution that worked because it fit environment and economy. As with all histories, there is more to uncover. Questions remain about exactly how widely some methods were used in particular regions, how trade influenced local choices about which stores to favour, and how seasonal variations affected long-distance voyages. Archaeology continues to refine our picture. Residue analysis, isotopic studies, and new excavations reveal details that the sagas skirt or formal records omit. Even the terminology is contested. Terms in Old Norse for preserved foods vary in meaning across time and place. And translating them into modern words like jerky or cheese simplifies complex traditions. Still, we can close by returning to the central mystery. How did a people cross the North Atlantic repeatedly, plant new settlements on distant coasts and sustain them across harsh winters without the cheap salts we imagine? The answer lies in systems of preservation that were ecological, redundant, and social. Wind became a dehydrating kiln. Acid, from whey and skyer, became a mobile on-farm preservative. Smoke transformed meat and fish into safer, tastier long-term provisions. The earth itself, in the form of peat bogs and cellars, acted as a cold vault. Together these elements formed an invisible scaffolding beneath Viking voyages and settlements. The mystery is less an enigma than an intricate plan executed by many hands across generations. If the idea that refrigeratorless societies could build a food architecture capable of supporting long-range voyaging surprises you, then remember that history often rewards looking beyond the obvious. Salt mattered, but wind, acid and smoke made a maritime world possible in places where salt was a rare commodity. The saga of the pantry, of hjels and smokehouses, of whey-strewn barrels and peat-buried butter, is one of practical intelligence as much as brute force. If you enjoy this exploration into how the Vikings preserved meat and fish without relying on salt, join us in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and propose the next mystery.